This is week 8 of Anthropology 2351. Today our first piece is called When I Wear My Alligator Boots, Narcoculture in the U.S.-Mexico Borderlands. This week is going to be very relevant to us because of our geographic context. I built this week into the syllabus for that reason. This piece is by Sheila Moolman and it was published in 2014. Moolman documents her observation of people moving in and out of trafficking or smuggling alongside relentless lack of other forms of viable work. There's this piece by Philippe Bourgeois, it's a book, and it's called In Search of Respect, and it's about how inner city black youth or Puerto Rican youth, I don't really remember very well, I'm sorry, but this is a gloss of the storyline. They end up selling crack on street corners because that is the economy that's available to them, right? And that's also the way within which they can gain respect given the immediate context of their social circles, right? And so that's why the book is called In Search of Respect. It kind of goes all the way back to when we were talking about Willis and the lads and how, you know, they're trying to do things on their terms, even though in reality that may actually be the only option available to them, but they're claiming it as their own terms, right? And so In Search of Respect is kind of extending that line of thought and saying that being part of a gang is almost like being part of a family. You know, it provides a certain amount of support as far as the social network that these youth otherwise don't have, and a way to gain respect in that social circle is through selling drugs. So this is a totally different geographic context. It's where we are, right? But there might be some similarities as far as people's motivations for why they do what they do. And one of the key things that we don't want to forget is that it's not just about respect, it's also about economy. It's about being able to feed yourself and your family, right? Because the thing that binds all these situations together is poverty. And in our climate, in our geographic context, we have a great deal of poverty. And so that's something we don't want to lose sight of. Moolman documents her observations. Okay, drug trafficking offers upward mobility and a sense of pride for norteños with few other economic opportunities. Her book is about the mundane local involvement of vulnerable individuals, including women, living in poor villages located in cartel territories. The ways that we often think of drug trafficking is that it's somehow separated from civilian life. Like there are those people who are drug traffickers and they have a certain lifestyle. And then there's the everyday civilians and their lifestyle is somehow separate. And also there's a lot of kind of like historia or fama around drug trafficking and the big cartel bosses and the stories that come out in the news, right? But in the regions where drugs are trafficked, this is an actual economy that's actually just woven into everyday life, right? And so she's pointing to the involvement of vulnerable individuals, poor individuals, including women. She tells the story of rural borderland people who are recruited to work in the lowest echelons and fringes of the drug trade. Entire communities are implicated, right? And I think that often the involvement of those people is not reflected upon, not considered. Okay. Slide 3. This is not the story of the powerful capos, but of the women who make them their sandwiches, the businessmen who launder their money, the addicts who consume their product, the mules who carry their money and drugs through borders and military checkpoints, and the men and women who serve out the prison sentences when the capos' operation go awry. There's an entire chain of people, and they all play different roles, right, that are either direct or a few steps removed from drug trafficking. And usually we're only considering a very small kind of facet of this community. And so what about the lives of these other people? And also to really signal that there is a very stark hierarchy within drug trafficking, and that the people who serve out the prison sentences are often not the people at the top of the chain, right? In essence, she argues that the drug trade not only functions through violent acts of murderous figures, but crucially through networks of ordinary people. If you're talking about places where there is no other industry, there is no other, logic. There are places where it's a tourist site, right? Tourism is what provides most people their livelihood through hotels and restaurants and so on and so forth. There's other places that have some natural resource that they produce, or some industry as far as factories, and that's what gives people their livelihood. But in these areas, it's drug trafficking. Another thing that I would quickly kind of mention is that the drug trafficking that we're talking about is international, right? Mexico produces the product, but the majority of the consumption is in the United States. And so this network does not stop at the border. The network definitely extends both sides of the border. And if you think about everything that we've thought about before as far as racial hierarchies, I would venture to guess that the people at the very, very top of this racial hierarchy within drug trafficking may potentially be white. Yeah. When I was in San Miguel de Allende in Guanajuato, there were some people in the town that had really, really lavish 6-story houses, like mansions, right? And they did philanthropy, meaning that they donated to good causes in the community. And so people held them in high regard. And one person that I'm thinking about in particular married a Mexican woman, and their children are half and half. And they go to a private school, and they live kind of a very upper class life in this place. But if you ask that person and his friends what their business is, they say that they do import and export of artesanías, which seems slightly suspect to me, right? But that's how it goes. And so I wonder if you guys have ever heard the saying that you don't defecate where you eat. So it's kind of like drug lords also have families, right? They have little daughters and little children that they want to keep safe. And so where they live is probably not in the heart of where the violence is. But anyway, I'm wondering about these kind of hierarchies and what that looks like racially, because I think we only see the lower echelons when it comes to who comes out in the news and who is serving out these prison sentences, etc., right? I think the same could probably be said for like white-collar crimes on Wall Street. All types of crimes that involve, really, really large sums of money, but are often not mediatized in the same way, right? And what we see in the media as far as this image of the criminal is definitely has a racial kind of overtone. Anyway, let me go on to slide 4. By tracing profit streams and policy decisions to wealthy nations and linking the legacy of border violence to antagonistic relations between U.S. and Mexico, she further complicates notions of in and out. We've talked about the border before and about how some social scientists would argue that it's not actually meant to keep people out, but meant to render people pliable and therefore exploitable, right? Because it produces the definition of illegal, even if the purpose is not to actually keep them out. Muhlman argues that increased legal trade through NAFTA also increased illegal trade. Therefore, neoliberalism, NAFTA, and U.S. drug consumption are key contributors to the rise of drug cartels in Mexico. Now, my husband he works as a federal public defender. That is the attorney that you get if you are unable to pay for your own attorney, right? And in our region, 95 to 99% of those people are illegal reentry cases, and oftentimes with drugs, either possession or dealing or production, whatever it is, right? But illegal reentry. And so some of the people that are his clients or that he's dealt with, they are truck drivers, right? And so if they're coming from northern Mexico and they're driving across the border with a truck full of illicit cargo, like legal cargo, right? And they are pulled aside, threatened, and told to bring across drugs mixed into their cargo or somewhere hidden inside their cargo. What are the options that they have, right? Because you can't really say no. If you say yes, you might get some payment for it, but you also, there's a chance that you'll get caught, but not every single truck is checked, and if it is checked, not in great depth, right? And so if you are that truck driver and you're weighing your options, you're living in a situation of poverty, you're driving trucks, you're pulled over, you're threatened, you're told that you must cross with this, and if you do, you'll get some payment for it. There's not really that many options for you, right? And so NAFTA, because it reduced the tariffs or eliminated the tariffs of products that are moving from Mexico to the United States and vice versa, there's a lot of traffic going on, a lot of movement, right? The volume of the amount of cargo trucks that cross every single day just surged after NAFTA, right? Which means that the checks, the completeness and the thoroughness of checks when trucks are crossing is going to be reduced, right? And so in this kind of indirect way, increased legal trade, increased illegal trade, even though it's often not acknowledged in that way. All right, on to slide 5. Mullman argues that the U.S. has, quote, outsourced violence related to the drug trade to Mexico. Mexico's militarization of the war on drugs has only increased violence in Mexico since organized crime functions in collusion with military and police. So, what she's saying here is that if we really think about drug trade as something that spans both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border, because the drugs are produced in Mexico, but then they're consumed in the United States, and they're moving fairly freely across the border due to all of the movement relating to NAFTA or post-NAFTA, right? Why is it that all the violence occurs on the Mexican side? And she is arguing that the U.S. has outsourced violence to Mexico instead of, producing its own drugs for the consumption of the population. They're produced elsewhere, and the violence is elsewhere. Then the second bullet point is about the notorious corruption in Mexico, right? And the corruption extends into all areas of Mexico, I would argue. I'm the most familiar with corruption in the healthcare system because I'm a medical anthropologist. But I recently submitted an article for consideration that has to do with governors and secretaries of health at the state level soliciting federal funds for Seguro Popular for their state, turning in a budget saying this is what I would use the funds for, and then proposing to build clinics and to build hospitals, and then hiring a phantom company that doesn't even exist so that they can embezzle the money and all the money then ends up in their pocket. Or having the project done in a really kind of cheap, half-assed way, and then there's a building there, but most of the money was funneled into their own accounts. Other examples are within Mexican laboratories and they have produced chemotherapy drugs that were to be applied and were applied in government hospitals to cancer patients. But the chemotherapy drugs were fake. They didn't actually have any chemotherapy in them. And so, of course, the cancer patients continued to get more and more ill because they weren't actively receiving treatment, even though they thought they were. And so there's been a lot of media around these healthcare scandals, to the point where secretaries of health and governors have fled and are fugitives, and kind of, being searched for by Interpol, etc. And so this argument that Molman is making about corruption in the military and the police, and that goes hand in hand with the drug cartels because sometimes they act in collusion, is not actually that far-fetched when you kind of just consider the culture of corruption that exists in Mexico. As a result, locals are concerned with cartel-related violence and human rights violations by law enforcement. If you were a common person in Mexico, and many of you may know this from your personal experience or experiences of friends and family, you often don't feel like you can turn to the police, right? So if some act of violence were done against you and you couldn't turn to law enforcement, you literally have no recourse. You have no one to help you, right? I think I saw a statistic once that said that 96% of crimes in Mexico are never prosecuted, meaning that if you commit a crime in Mexico, the vast probability is that there will be no punishment for your crime, which makes it kind of a lawless sort of place. And I definitely felt that way when I was living there. All right, I am now on slide 6. This is our second piece, Violence and Activism at the Border, Gender, Fear, and Everyday Life in Ciudad Juarez by Kathleen Stout, published in 2008. Kathleen Stout writes a lot about the U.S.-Mexico border and issues around feminism and women, and so if you liked her piece, you definitely can look into her further and read other pieces of her writing. Stout points to how the world's attention focused on ghastly femicides in Juarez, inadvertently obfuscating the ordinariness of women killing in many countries, especially at the hands of husbands, boyfriends, partners, friends, or neighbors. So it's kind of like when there's a kidnapping or a disappearance. Certain children disappear, and it's a really big thing in the media. I think other children may disappear, and it's like radio silence, right? It's a similar point. She's saying that there's all this media attention around these ghastly femicides in Juarez, this kind of outrage and uproar about how women's lives are being lost at a very, very rapid rate, right? And people are appalled. And in no way is she, nor I, indicating that that's not warranted. That, no, we shouldn't care as much. Of course we should. But what she's saying is that many women die every single day at the hands of their romantic partners and people around them. And there's not the same outrage. Why? Because a woman dying is a woman dying is a woman dying, right? Or a woman being murdered is the same. And so, I'm sure many of you know that if a woman is killed, the statistical probability, if you had to statistically anticipate the single person who is probably culpable, would be who? Her romantic partner, whoever that is, right? So that person is definitely going to be looked at because that is the most likely person, given what happens just statistically. So she's kind of pointing at this. And when conceptualizing female homicide, her explanatory framework includes the global neoliberal economy, comparative institutions, and gendered power. She argues that the construction of, quote, masculinities in a socially constructed and, quote, dazzlingly patriarchal society and men's loss of power and control in the general economy and private household lead to men becoming violent. Now, I think I've explained to you before the difference between an analytical argument and a normative argument. And if I haven't done it yet, then I'm going to reiterate it now so that you guys remember. A normative argument is something that sets out to say, this is right and this is wrong and this is why. Or this is good and this is bad, or this is what you should think, basically. This is, it offers an opinion. It casts a moral judgment, right? Whereas an analytical argument is simply saying, let me analyze what is going on without casting judgment, right? And so it's one thing to kind of look at homosexuality trends over a period of time and see how they may have changed, or see how interethnic attraction works within homosexual partnerships versus heterosexual partnerships, or see how the success rate of monogamous homosexual relationships versus heterosexual relationships, or look at parenting styles among homosexual people and if the roles are different than in heterosexual couples, etc., 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 etc. I mean, you could go on and say, you could cast a million ways that you could kind of, try to understand better homosexuality. It's an entirely different thing to set out to make an argument about whether homosexuality is right or wrong as kind of a moral practice, right? Those are two different projects. And I think that most often, anthropology, especially critical anthropology, the goal is to create an analytical argument, not a normative argument, right? So here, she's arguing that there's a certain way that masculinities, because of course it's different for different people, so there's not just one way of being masculine, within this dazzlingly patriarchal Mexican society, we often refer to machismo, how that history, when held in the context of an economy where men are losing power and control and not able to provide for their households as breadwinners as they have historically, how that can be very emasculating for some men and produce deep feelings of frustration, which contribute to them lashing out in violent ways. I do not think here that she is constructing a normative argument where she's saying, well, this is why, so therefore it's okay, right? I think that you can say, this is why, period, and have that be the whole sentence, not comma, and therefore it's right or therefore it's wrong, right? But she's trying to describe analytically how a shift in the economy and how a shift in men's ability to fulfill what they consider to be a good man's duties in the world, how that affects the way that men behave interpersonally with women in their lives, and how it can have a very, very negative effect when men constantly feel disappointed in themselves, when they feel emasculated because of the economy, and them not being able to live up to what they have held as expectations for themselves, or what society has held as expectations for themselves. That is not to say that it's okay. It is to provide an analytical argument. All right, slide 7. In her book, she aims to examine the incidence of violence against women. This includes domestic violence, sexual violence, and murder. and examine the work of anti-violence activists, analyze the responses of law enforcement to violence against women, and consider preventative and protective strategies from both sides of the border. Stout shifts the border from periphery to center in order to consider broader struggles about democracy, violence, and impunity. All right, so I'm going to reflect a tiny bit on this second bullet point, which is that when we consider the border, oftentimes, just in our mind space, our unit of analysis is the nation, the U.S., Mexico, etc., etc. And then the border in our mind's eye is at the very edge, right? It's like at the end of the nation. But for her, she's saying, well, the nation is not our unit of analysis. The border is what we're analyzing. Therefore, it's front and center in our story. It's not about the U.S., it's not about Mexico, it's about the border. She's kind of redefining space, right? And that is going to help us to consider this reconfiguration of our unit of analysis is going to help us consider issues like violence, democracy, and impunity. Impunity is kind of just a total lack of regard for the law, right? Which, as I've mentioned, when you have 96% of crimes that go unpunished or unprosecuted, then you can imagine there's a very high degree of impunity. All right, slide 8. Despite similarities in women reporting physical violence in the U.S. and Mexico, 1 in 4, women and girls are 6 times more likely to be murdered in Mexico. El Paso is among the safest cities in the U.S., while Juarez is one of the most dangerous cities in Mexico. Okay, so I'm going to break this bullet point down. 1 in 4 is very, very high, right? Physical violence. I once also, I'm not sure if this statistic continues to be correct, but something like 1 in 3 women, or 1 in 4, something like that, experience rape in their lifetime. Remember when I first heard this statistic, it was when I was in high school. We were having kind of like a self-defense sort of training as teenage girls. And at the time, I was a super jock, and I was on the wrestling team. And so was one of my female friends. And then I had a third female friend. And she was kind of like reflecting on this, statistic that we'd been told. And she goes, well, it's definitely not going to be you. It's definitely not going to be her. So out of the 3 of us, it's probably me. Right? And it seems like a very kind of absurd thing to say, but it's also kind of tragic that that's a statistic, and that's how she would put it into perspective for us as a trio. Okay, so there's the first part of that. The second part is that even though we've talked so many times about how the border is so porous, right? If you've come to focus groups, then we've talked about how many members of our community will go across the border for shopping, to get medical care, for dental visits, etc., 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 right? And remesas, money, is often sent back to family members in Mexico, right? And visits for over the holidays or whatever, right? There's a lot of movement back and forth, a lot of culture moves back and forth. There's a lot of Mexican culture that's reflected here on this side of the border, a lot of traditions, the language, etc., 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 right? And so if we're talking about culture, if we're talking about economy, if we're talking about goods, services, none of these things stop at the border, right? We are kind of a transnational community. So why would it be that murders of women and girls are 6 times more likely, even though that the high degree of reported physical violence is the same? on both sides of the border. And I would venture to say that it has a lot to do with that degree of impunity that we were just reflecting on, right? The lack of consequences for harming another person. Like Molman, she points to forces of economic supply and demand, production and consumption, and kinship and friendship that tie people who are differently governed in distinct economies together in cooperative, complicit, transborder relationships. Let me take a slight additional reflection on the prior bullet point, which is that it might not just be impunity, it might also be that other comment that she made about how men in that kind of norteño society are in a situation of not being able to fulfill their gender roles. And perhaps the formal kind of economy is jobs are more available on the U.S. side than on the Mexican side. That could also be another contributor. But this is something to kind of have you guys reflect about and perhaps discuss on Thursday and think more about. All right, so we are this transborder community, right? There's many transborder relationships. Also echoing Woolman, she writes, while media attention often focuses on drug lords, it is important to understand the broad networks of mid and low-level players in drug marketing and distribution, especially in areas of high unemployment and poverty rates, right? So the vulnerability of a community and the likelihood that they will participate in drug trafficking is very, very closely correlated to the degree of unemployment and how extreme the poverty is in that place. All right, slide 9. The two authors similarly point to NAFTA, a deal made in narco heaven, and the militarization of the border. Stout examines how criminals escape across the border, while victims seek higher justice standards across the border as well. She argues that, given the global economic context for extensive legal and illegal trade, cross-border solidarity is required. And this is something that is being reiterated from last week when we were thinking about immigration, migration, and one of the arguments from the week is that regional approaches should be considered. Because if every country considers mobilities of people to be the other country's problem, right, then there is no cooperation between countries. Here, she's not talking about illegal immigration, she's talking about violence. But she's saying that in order to meet this challenge, cross-border solidarity is required. From 19, we have this quote. At the U.S.-Mexico border, violence against women derives from and symbolizes flawed governance and criminal justice institutions. Whether the violence involves more than a decade of femicide and its hundreds of victims, or the everyday domestic violence and tens of thousands of survivors. Whether at the border or elsewhere, violence against women is an expose of the state, masculine privilege embedded therein, and unequal gender power relations in state and society. Okay, I'm going to break this down. What is governance? Governance is kind of the art and science of governing a population, right? Of exercising authority and rendering a law kind of valid over a population. And so here she is signaling flawed governance. She's saying that if there's violence against women, it's not just about the perpetrator. It's not just about the person who committed the violent act against that woman, right? It goes all the way back to the state and to defects in how that government is governing the population. She is basically indicting the criminal justice system. Furthermore, she again reminds us that although we're talking about a decade of femicide and hundreds of victims on the one hand, that we cannot lose sight of everyday domestic violence and tens of thousands of survivors, even if their suffering or the violence that's committed against them is not as visible in global media. Furthermore, she says that violence against women, no matter where it is, whether it's at the border or not, is an expose of the state and masculine privilege embedded therein. Now, how do we talk about masculine privilege? Well, I'm going to be the first person to say that privilege is a very, very slippery kind of analytic to hold on to, right? Because privilege is very rarely ever black and white, right? And so I will use myself as an example, as I often do. So people are very intersectional creatures, right? We are not just gendered beings. We are also racialized. We also have certain socioeconomic contexts that we live in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? As a woman, someone could argue that I am less privileged than a man could argue, right? I'll continue with that thread in a second. As a person of color, someone could also argue that I'm less privileged than a white counterpart. There's also a little more to be unpacked there because not all people of color are the same, right? There are certain groups and ethnicities and races that have a certain experience of discrimination that cannot be mapped on perfectly to another group's experience, right? I remember when I was applying to graduate school, I was up for the Chancellor's Fellowship, which was a tad higher than the Regent's Fellowship as far as kind of the salary or the amount of money that they give you to do your doctoral studies there. And in the end, I was given the Regents but not the Chancellor's because they said that I was not diverse enough. Which is very kind of like, what do they mean, you know? What they were referring to is that I'm half Chinese. And at UC Berkeley, 60-some-odd% of the entire student population is Asian. Majority is Asian. Majority there, because it's of where it is located, is not white. And so the thing that you could be to be not diverse is Asian, not white, right? And so that makes me only half an underrepresented ethnic category. The other half is overly represented. So depends on who you're talking to as far as being of color, right? Depends on the context. Then you would say, okay, but you know, I grew up in a single parent household. That means something. I would say that that's a disadvantage. But you could also say that the single parent that I did have did give me a lot of opportunities when it comes to kind of education, et cetera, et cetera. That would be an advantage, right? So in the end, if you really were to look at me as an example, I'm a mixed bag. I would not be able to honestly take on the label of underprivileged as a blanket statement. I would say I'm privileged in many ways. I would say I have had some challenges too, right? But I think that's the case for most people. I think just to kind of cast men as an entire category and just say all men are privileged, well, but they're also intersectional, right? It would be a different thing to be a homosexual man of color than a white man, you know, and a very affluent white man. Right? Those are very different positions of power. And I could just give you more and more examples, but the thing that I'm getting to is that privilege is very relative. Like, privilege as compared to what, right? Privilege as compared to who? So privilege is a very, very slippery category. And so I'm not going to say that men are not privileged. I'm just saying that there's something there to be examined instead of just to be accepted at first blush, right? But what he's going with is probably this, right? It's that before Trump was elected to his presidency, he said some very disparaging things about women. And he also said them in a way where it made it sound like it was okay to grope women and to touch them in ways that were not welcome, and to be kind of very disrespectful and very violating to their bodies, right? And it was very public, it was in a video, and he was still elected president, which almost gives it a veneer of being okay, right? Because if it was absolutely not okay, why would he still have been elected if there were enough people to stand up and say that we will not vote for someone who's this way?
Even women voted.
Yeah. And so I think this is what this is pointing to when it says that it's an expose of the state, an expose of the government, and the masculine privilege embedded therein, right? I would say that this absolutely exists in our current administration in the United States, where you could say that there is a great deal of masculine privilege in our current government, right? At the same time, I'm still going to argue, from my personal perspective, that privilege is relative, people are intersectional, we have to have a very kind of nuanced perspective when we're talking about relative privilege of one person compared to another, right? Okay. And unequal gender power relations in state and society. Recently, I was watching a documentary of someone who I believe was a congresswoman who had experiences of sexual harassment and or, very sexually inappropriate experiences, but had no recourse within that system. Women are heavily outnumbered. There is a mediation sort of process by which it never comes to light to the public. And then that other person can still get remunerated for their post, even if they're invisibly being reprimanded, because there are things set in place so that the public never finds out about what had happened, right? If we think about everything that's coming out with the Time's Up movement, about Larry Nassar, about all the girls that, we're not talking about one or two, right? We're talking about hundreds with Harvey Weinstein, and kind of the number of years that it takes and the number of victims before anything comes to light, right? If you think about how that's even possible, how is it possible that there would be hundreds of victims before anybody says something? And I think that is kind of sheds a light on these unequal gender power relations in state and society. So it's something to think about, right? Okay, on to slide 10. This is our last piece for this week. It's called Making a Killing: Femicide, Free Trade, and La Frontera, edited by Alicia Gaspar de Alba with Georgia Guzman. This edited volume focuses on Las Indias del Sur, the hundreds of murdered and thousands of missing women and girls on the El Paso-Juarez border. The victims are often poor and disenfranchised, rural, dark-skinned, and indigenous-looking. Going back to all the references that I've made to intersectionality, right, and intersecting axes of discrimination, these individuals are very, very vulnerable. Not only are they poor and disenfranchised, they're also from a rural kind of place, which would lend you to think that maybe they're not very educated, right? They're dark-skinned, they're indigenous-looking, which in Mexico is a racial disadvantage, right? And so they're racially, economically, geographically, and based on gender, very, very vulnerable. Most of them make their living as maquiladoras, but are sometimes referred to as maquilocas, implying that they're living la vida loca, which is that they're engaged in prostitution. Whether or not that's true is, I'm sure, a case-by-case sort of thing, but there are implications being made. On that last note, I was reading something for my global health class over the summer. And we don't have time to read it in this class, but it's relevant to this last bullet point because it's about HIV and about women in Africa and the logic by which they choose their sexual partners and have sexual partners, right? And there, men express their masculinity by having multiple partners at once. Like, the more partners you have, the more masculine you are, right? But there's also the expectation that you provide economically for each one of your partners. So kind of the more you earn, the more that you provide, the more partners that you have, the more masculine you are perceived by the community. For the women, there is often an expectation of monogamy to their one provider, but sometimes that's not the case. I have a friend who researches HIV in Africa, and she was telling me about a young college-age girl who has her minister of education, her minister of communication, and what this means is that she has one who pays her college tuition, she has another one who pays her cell phone bill, she has et cetera, right? And so from a U.S. perspective, this might seem like sex work or prostitution. But if we back away from kind of the normative elements of that argument, we put on a more analytical lens, and we think not through our own context, but just accept an unattached observation, right? One of the things that the book that I was reading, argued, is that it's not prostitution, that almost all sexual relationships, really, the book was arguing. Now I'm going to kind of speak for the book, right? That all sexual relationships have an economic element. But the only difference is the timing of the payment. That if you are a prostitute and you're doing sex work, then the timing of the payment and the sex act coincide. You get paid at the time of the sex, right? But if you are dating someone, there is often, even in North American society, the expectation that the man will pay for dinner, invite you out, pay for dates, buy you presents along the way until eventually you have a sexual relationship, right? So the timing is different because it's not that there's the economic investment and that immediately coincides with the sex act, but there still is more of an expectation on the part of men that they will be investing economically in the woman than that the woman will do that for the man, right? Another part of this book was arguing that there has been such a thing as bride's wealth, right, in many, many countries. Nowadays, there is the engagement ring, and that there's this very illogical idea attached to the engagement ring that the more expensive it is, the greater the man's love for the woman that he's proposing to. Like, if a man who was fairly well off came and offered like a, sterling silver ring to his intended fiance, she might be offended by this and say, well, what gives, right? So that there's an expectation that the man will make an investment in the woman, and that signifies his degree of commitment and his degree of love for her, right? And that in marriages, there definitely is a lot of investment that usually flows from man to woman. Now, I would argue that this is changing, right? I'm not sure. I think that maybe the partnership and marriage is changing faster than the courtship pattern, because I think that often there's still this expectation for men to invest more heavily during the dating process, and often also for men to invest in things like engagement rings, that women don't go buy engagement rings for men, you know. But one of the arguments in this book is that all sexual relationships have an economic element. The only difference is the timing of the payment. And that you could argue the more impoverished the context, the closer and closer the economic investment is going to be to the moment of the sex act, right? But also, when she was talking about the African context in the book, the women that she was talking about were actually middle class and upper class. They weren't impoverished, but they were often about college aged, and they were just using different boyfriends to kind of finance parts of their lives. But this is how it works, right? And she was arguing that in U.S. sort of through a U.S. lens, it would probably be something similar to having a sugar daddy, right? Is it that you have no feelings for your sugar daddy? Maybe if that's not the case, maybe there is affection for the sugar daddy, right? But he's still a sugar daddy. It's different than a marriage, but it's also not a John that you are having as a prostitute, right? There's a more kind of continuity and more companionship that happens. Anyway, so my point here is, are maquiladoras prostitutes? I said that it's probably a case-by-case basis, and I stand by that. But I also would say that it's a lot more complex than are they prostitutes or not, because you have to look at the economic situation, you have to look at kind of culturally what's happening in that community, et cetera, right? And so asking if they're prostitutes or not might be flattening the situation, turning it into an easy question when it's really not that easy. That was the whole reason why I went off in this very long sort of aside. All right, slide 11. Gaspar de Alba argues that the only reason why we know about these muchachas del sur and the squalid and inhumane conditions in which they lived, examples are squatter colonies with no electricity, no running water, no sewage system, no paved streets, and no city services whatsoever, is because they are dead. And that's really, really kind of a harsh, but perhaps true thing to say, right? She's saying that as a greater society, these women are more valuable to us dead than alive. Because when they were alive, there's millions of people around the world, perhaps billions, that live in these types of situations with no running water, no sewage system, etc., etc. But our thoughts are never focused towards those people, right? We're just totally unaware of their existence. But as dead women, muchachas del sur suddenly kind of get splashed across our television screens or in articles, newspaper articles, and then capture people's concern. A native of El Paso, Gaspar de Alba became frustrated with the lack of El Paso media coverage of Juarez news, and signals the inattention of academics to borderland femicide. So here she's also pointing to the fact that the media coverage that you get on one side of the border versus the other is very different, right? And that is kind of disturbing, given where we live and how close we are to the border, right? That there can be something happening just 5 or 10 or 15 miles that way, and it can be explosive and huge and just terrifying for the people living there. And we can go about our day having absolutely no idea that anything's happening. And so it's disturbing if we think about it given our context. Similarly, in her chapter, Elvia Arriola highlights the fatal indifference of corporations and government policies in regard to the vulnerability of the female workforce. So just how we were thinking about this argument that it's an expose of the state, right? That violence against women signals flawed governance, right? Here, Elvia Arriola is pointing to the fact that when the female workforce is harmed, she's pointing a finger at corporations and governmental policies that must be indifferent, fatally indifferent, for this to continue, right? Okay, I'm now going to show a clip from a documentary.